On episode 344 of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet Dr. Kenneth Pelletier and discuss his book, Change Your Genes, Change Your Life, Creating Optimal Health with the New Science of Epigenetics. You can find the full show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/344. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness Podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. Our guest today is a clinical professor of medicine and psychiatry at the University of California School of Medicine in San Francisco. He is a medical consultant to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the World Health Organization, the Federation of State Medical Boards, and major corporations. He's also the best-selling author of the book, Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer. Today we're going to talk about his book, Change Your Genes, Change Your Life. It's a wonderful conversation about epigenetics. I know you're going to enjoy it. With no further ado, here's Dr. Kenneth Pelletier. So Dr. Pelletier, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You know, the book is called Change Your Genes, and I just, you know, the topic of genes and how what we're learning just in the last couple decades it's just been fascinating to me. It's one of those things. Whenever I see an article or a book, I want to read that because I know that we've learned so much and we're learning so much now that I'm going to get something valuable out of it. And I definitely got some value out of your book.
Thank you. That's good to hear. And you're right. I mean, genetics, testing and the promise of genetics or the lack of delivery on the promise of genetics really is the hot topic in the last 5 years. And it's going to be really into the near future.
Yeah, when they went through the process of sequencing the genome or basically understanding how all of this was supposed to work, you know, there was this flood of news out there that, you know, they were going to be able to fix everything, just practically everything. That didn't quite play out because I think from the genes, what we learned when we were in school was, you know, your eye color. Other things are determined by a gene based on, you know, families and you know, we learned that. I've unlearned a lot of it since then, but it's you know, there's really only a small percentage of our genes that are really fixed like that are going to do, you know, this gene is going to affect eye color or this gene's going to do or cause maybe potentially this particular disease, but it's really a small percentage of them that work that way, right?
Yeah, it's actually a very small percentage. It's probably as low as 5%. And those are known as fully penetrant genes or monogenic genes. So conditions like lateral sclerosis that are clearly genetically caused, those will show up usually in the first 6 months of life. And that's in effect, 5% that we know is monogenic or fully penetrant. After that, after the first 6 months of life, the vast majority of what we see as late life chronic disease is caused by the interaction between the gene and the environment. And that's the basis for epigenesis. So epigenesis means above and beyond or over the gene. So it's all of the influences that impact the gene after that first, 6 months. Now, there are late life conditions that show up that do have a genetic expression, but the reality is, again, we may have an 80% likelihood of a certain condition at any time in our life, but it means that people who have the identical same gene, there are 20% of them that never have that disease show up. The question is, why? And that is the fundamental question that's now come up with epigenesis. And it's interesting because James Watson, of the Watson and Crick, the discoverers of the structure of the DNA in 1954, was the first human to have his human genome completely mapped. That was about 5, maybe 6 years ago now. And there's a great quotation that if he brought his completely mapped human genome to his family doctor, that he or she would know 1 to 3% more about his health than from just doing a good physical. So 1 to 3%, that's a pretty insignificant amount.
It is. It's hard to see that though, because, and I'll give you, my story was, my father and my mother split up when I was very, very young. So I never really spent time with my father, knew much about him. But more and more now that I am getting to know him and that side of the family, there's so many similarities between my father and I, from the way we look, the way we act, just almost everything we do. There's just this, I'm very like him. And so you see that on the outside. There's this genetic component that's, I guess, driving me to look and behave similar to my father. But what we're seeing is still only a very small percentage of what's out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. In the book, I'm very clear. I'm not denying the reality of genetic predisposition. I mean, that's very real. In fact, there's a whole chapter in there where I look at what do we really know about genetic inheritance, and you've just rattled off, color of your hair, certain looks, certain features. If you think about it, those are relatively superficial. But what we're looking at are the deeper issues of how, what kinds of illnesses will you have? How healthy will you be? How long will you live? What's going to happen to your cognition, your mental acuity, your physical fitness levels? What are your dietary preferences and what's the impact on you as an adult? Those things are governed by a deeper layer of biochemistry. And that's really what we're looking at, is what things do we have within our control that we can influence day in and day out that change the predisposition. So the title of the book, Change Your Genes, is actually a trick title, because the genes actually don't change. Genes are fixed. And what does change is the expression. So whether a gene becomes expressed or suppressed depends on everything that happens between it, other genes, our internal environment, our physical environment, radiation exposure, environmental toxins, etc. So we have genes that do give you a certain look, a certain high color, etc. within your family. But then we have all of the other influences happening throughout our life that govern really pretty much most of what constitutes our adult life and functioning.
Yeah, so that turning, I guess I want to go past the language, because I had always thought of epigenetics as being turning a gene on or off from an expression perspective. But you mentioned in the book that it's not always an on or off. Sometimes it's more like a dimmer switch.
Actually, it is a dimmer switch, and and the common language is a gene turning on or turning off, but that's not really the case. It is precisely like a dimmer switch. So the gene itself is surrounded by a molecular coating. They're called single nucleotide polymorphisms, which is really a mouthful. They refer to as SNPs, SNP, lowercase s, SNPs. And these SNPs are what interact with the biochemistry within the cell, which is like an ocean. So the gene is in an ocean within the cell, and the ocean is influenced by everything in our life, our diet, our stress. And so that's really how the gene gets regulated, and the term really is regulated. So it is like a dimmer switch. You can either turn up an influence or turn it down. You can turn it off altogether. You can turn it on full bore. In most cases, we don't want that to happen. But that's that mechanism of dialing like a rheostat on a light dimmer is actually exactly how the gene expression occurs.
Okay. And there are 7, what you call biologic pathways that kind of cause this dimmer switch to be adjusted. Do you mind going through the 7?
No, not at all. I mean, there are 7, this is basic human biochemistry, but there are really 7 pathways in the human body. And each of those pathways are governed by a multiplicity of genes. And those 7 pathways are at the end of which determine your state of health and illness And the way it shows up in our body is you have biomarkers. So you'll have an indication of inflammation or not, or degree of inflammation. Some inflammation is good, too much is bad. So just to rattle them off, and we can discuss any one of them in detail, is methylation. And methylation is a molecule that is, it's like the period at the end of a sentence. It tells a gene, okay, that's the end of your statement, period, end of discussion. That's methylation. And the other is inflammation that we're all very familiar with. And there's acute versus chronic inflammation. There's oxidative stress. So it's literally the stress induced in the act of metabolism. Every time we, metabolize any food product, it involves oxygen. And there are more or less degrees of oxygenation that occurs. So oxidative stress is the third. Detoxification is the fourth. Our body, our liver, our intestinal tract is constantly detoxifying things from the environment and our food, et cetera. The fifth is immunity. So it's how does the body, the basic function of the immune system is to differentiate self from not self, who you are from every other pathogen, person, or thing in the environment. So that distinguishes kind of the border between us and our environment, between us and other people, is your immune system. So it maintains the integrity of your biochemistry. The sixth is lipid metabolism. And so that's basically how well do we digest and utilize fats. And the way that this has a very direct impact on many people is we have the statement, we're all supposed to eat a low-fat diet. That's simply not accurate at all. There are some people that can consume an enormous amount of saturated fats, both animal and protein and the plant-based, and they have no problems whatsoever. They don't develop heart disease. It isn't a predisposing factor. There are other people who are highly sensitive to lipids, and they have to really restrict their diet. And we can talk about how this whole area of epigenetics helps us identify really optimal diets as opposed to general guidelines. And the last is mineral metabolism. And so those minerals are all of the nutrients and trace elements in whole foods. So how well does the body manage that as the basis for hormone production, for basic body chemistry? So those 7 pathways, again, are basic human biochemistry. That's in virtually every biochemical text. But what we're now finding is that each of these are governed in turn by genes, and usually a collection of genes. And how those genes regulate, and again, in the way we talked about, like a rheostat, these pathways result in biomarkers or changes that we can detect in the human blood. And that in turn affects our organs, our state of health, et cetera. So it's this chain reaction, if you will, from the bottom on up.
Okay. So as I kind of understand this, then, well, from a health perspective, and right now we're really kind of getting into some of those chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's. What we're doing in our lifestyle is in our behaviors is driving, and some of the chemicals we're exposed to, and inflammation that we experience, and oxidative stress. All those things are working within our bodies based on our gene profile and which of our genes have been ratcheted up or ratcheted back down.
Absolutely. You just described very accurately the whole process. Exactly. And again, these are standard pathways, whether you're looking at integrative medicine or conventional medicine, or, these all exist within the human body. What's really new is that we're finding that these pathways are under our influence. These are not biological mechanisms that are set in place and invariant and just run. These are influenced by everything we do day in and day out. And I think that's both the good news and the bad news. Someone might say, well, that scares me. I don't want to have that much control over my life and my destiny and my health. And other people say, wow, that's great. It means I have a greater influence over my own health and on longevity and well-being than I ever thought. And my book really comes down on the latter case, which is, this is good news if you know what these pathways are, if you know what your genetic predisposition is, and if you know what you can do about it. That's all good news.
And it is. It is. I mean, if someone knows, okay, well, I lost my, grandmother to diabetes. I lost my grandfather, my father to diabetes. So you see that family lineage. That's not your destination. It just, you may be more predisposed to diabetes, but there are things that you can actually do to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely. There are many studies of identical twins. And what those studies indicate is that a very, very small percentage of major chronic diseases like cancers, heart disease, diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, very few of those are actually the same in adult twins. So you have identical twins that have exactly the same genetic code, if you will, built into their cells. But as adults, you have maybe 30% of them manifest the same cancer, maybe 10% manifest the same heart disease. So the actual percentage of a disease in a person's gene among identical twins is very low. So that means that everything that each of them have been doing differently in their life is really the governing factor. And again, to me, that's kind of very exciting news because genes are not our destiny. They're clearly a push, and some of the pushes are good. And again, it's not always vulnerabilities. There really are two basic models that you see in the public information literature on genes. One is a disease model. So like 23andMe gives a prediction about the likelihood of you having a particular disease. That's a disease model. And I honestly I'm not supportive of that because you and I would submit our genes and we would have virtually the same information come back. So it's not really a predictive model. And the other, it's statistical. It says you have a 60% chance or 40% chance, which means, what about the other 30 or 40 or sometimes more than 50% of people with the identical profile who don't have that particular disease? The other is the area of healthy biomarkers, which is what we're really talking about, which is how do you identify when these markers are telling you that you have a higher than normal inflammation or a lower than normal inflammation, and what can you do about that to maintain this optimal zone? So it's really, again, it's a health model. You're using the same technology, but you're reading it differently. And one of the analogies I use is that if you walk in a supermarket, everything has a barcode. If you could read the barcodes, you would know a tremendous amount of that about that lettuce or that soup or that cereal. It would be, where it came from, what the date was, some certain contents, et cetera. But we don't have the means to read the barcode. So we just look at it. It's a mystery. It's exactly that same way with genetics. We are born as human beings with a barcode, and now we're learning to read it. And that's what's really fascinating.
Yeah, what I liked about this was that it helps me understand why two people can basically do the same things, live the same way, but have very different health outcomes. I've always felt from an eating perspective, someone will sit there and they'll say, well, the Inuits ate just fat and they did just great. And I'll be like, okay, great. And then, someone else will sit there and say, well, no, you just eat fruit and vegetables. And I think, well, my ancestors, because I actually did the 23andMe, and I was more fascinated about where my ancestors were from than anything else. And I don't know what the 2.6% Neanderthal actually means, but that's out there. But my lineage, everybody above me, they're from Northern and Eastern Europe. And so in kind of looking at that as a lifestyle where what they would have eaten, they would not have had access to tropical fruits.
Correct. Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, just as a side note, you mentioned about 2.6% Neanderthal in your chart. Virtually every person that's tested will, in fact, show up as having Neanderthal genes because at certain points in evolution, Neanderthal and what we now know as Homo sapiens interbred. And so there are these Neanderthal genetic predispositions in our bodies, and that's quite a recent discovery. And one of the avenues of thought is that because this is, in effect, a more primitive genetic predisposition, that some of what we see as violence or post-traumatic stress syndrome or other kinds of hyperaggression in individuals may, in fact, be this Neanderthal gene manifesting itself. So that's another kind of little subset of genetics, which is kind of fascinating.
Okay, so I could just tell someone, don't bring it out. I got this 2.6 out here. Just
That's it. That's it. And you've really hit on the essence of what the book is about, which is once you know. So if you know that you had both parents were smokers, or both parents had obesity, or whatever the predisposition is, and you get your genes tested and you found, oh, well, you have a low lipid metabolism quotient, so you're predisposed not to metabolize fats very rapidly or completely. So once you know that, then you say, okay, well, I then have to pay more attention to my diet. I need to, in fact, have a low-fat, kind of Mediterranean, ideally kind of diet. So it's that knowledge that you can use to change your, in effect, destiny into something that you can regulate. And diet is the single most potent influence on gene expression that we know of. Stress is another, and certain biochemical exposures from the environment, but diet has a huge part to play in genetics. So to me, whenever I'm at conferences and you hear one speaker after another, and there's one saying the ketogenic diet, and then another one says no, Paleolithic, and then there's high fat, and then there's low fat and no fat, and various forms of fasting. Well, those are all general guidelines, general recommendations. So it's like a suit of clothing or a dress. If you buy it off the rack, that's fine, but it's never going to fit you perfectly. And it's all in the tailoring that makes it uniquely you, makes it look good, makes it look like a high quality piece of clothing. So all of these guidelines kind of fit someone, but they don't fit anyone. And until you know your own biochemistry, your own composition, your own genetic code, then you don't know which of those match up with you. Maybe you really are a paleo diet. Maybe you really are a non-fat diet. Maybe you are a periodic fasting person, but you don't know until you get this code deciphered. And it will tell you sometimes things as specifically as consume walnuts, not almonds, because you can digest walnuts by your genetic predisposition and pathway, but almonds are relatively indigestible for you, or you even have an allergy to almonds, like some people have peanut allergies. That's a genetic predisposition. So again, it's a matter of specificity, and this specificity is giving rise. I think you've heard this phrase. We're hearing personalized medicine. Even the Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, uses the phrase personalized medicine. That's what we're coming to, where you use these tests, these assays, this knowledge to really make these general guidelines applicable to you.
Okay, so if I want to buy a suit off the rack as far as how to eat, and then I want to start tailoring it myself, what approach would you start with, and then how would you go about deciding your tailoring needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll maybe be very personal. When I look at all of the dietary recommendations, there really is only one diet that has a large body of research over decades, with both the biochemistry makes sense, the epidemiology makes sense, the disease outcomes, et cetera. It's basically the Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet is literally the diet that is consumed by countries along the southern part of the Mediterranean, so Greece, Italy, France, Spain, Turkey, that region, North Africa even. So that region has a very particular diet, which has predominantly fish as a protein source, not red meat. It has high in vegetables and fruit, and deeply colored vegetables and fruit. So you can think about carrots and tomatoes, or apples and oranges. So fruits and vegetables that are deeply colored, leafy green vegetables, etc. It has a moderate alcohol consumption, which is kind of a nice thing, and high. It's basically high fiber, high natural, and all in effect natural ingredients. These are not ideally products that are grown with a great deal of chemistry involved in their growth. So the Mediterranean diet is kind of the optimal diet with the most research underlying it. And if you think about many of the other diets that are touted in terms of fat content, fasting, not fasting, high protein, low protein, they're really variants of the Mediterranean diet. Ironically, to me, there have been, again, studies. There was a Journal of the American Medical Association published a study in the last year that looked at 7 or 8 of the common diets that are touted in public. And they followed people out. They looked at the outcomes at 1 year. And what was interesting is there were no differences. There were weight losses on all of the diets, or improvements in health status on all of the diets for about 3 to 6 months. And then there was what's called regression to the mean. Basically, people went back to their usual baseline. And at 1 year, these positive changes that had shown up in 3 to 6 months were all gone. People had gained weight. They were back to eating how they were. They had unhealthy biomarkers. So basically, all the diets are either equally good or equally bad, depending on your perspective. But
I guess I would think that might be the Hawthorne effect. You know, are you familiar with that? When you're being watched, you tend to be a little bit more spot on. You need to, you know, they looked at it from a work perspective. Workers that were watched worked harder. And I think maybe in that first 3 months, they know, okay, I'm being tracked. And, you know, at that point, they've got this, I want to be good. And then after a while, the Hawthorne effect wears off. So the observer's still there, but they begin to ignore the observer. So I think that might just be a human behavior thing more so than to really say that a diet worked or not, because I think a lot of people probably just fell off the wagon at that point. Or were they still really trying to eat that way?
Absolutely. You hit it right on the head. Any dietary change that forces you to pay attention to what you're eating, you will lose weight and your health will improve, period. Doesn't matter what it is. So kind of pick any diet that you think is going to be the wonderful diet that's going to cure all your ills. And if you stick with it for 10 to 12 weeks, you will get benefits. You'll lose weight. You'll look better, feel better until you go off it, which is, you know, so the issue is not, can we change our diet and improve our health? The issue is, can we change our diet and sustain it for a lifetime? That's the biggest challenge in integrative medicine, or more, you know, even in conventional medicine. The biggest challenge is not, can you help people? Can people stop smoking? Can they reduce alcohol? Can they reduce weight, et cetera? Can they increase exercise? The answer is yes to all of those. That's unequivocal. We've got tons of research that demonstrate that. What we don't have is research on how do people sustain that change. And going back to the JAMA study, to me, one of the most amusing things was that the diet that actually showed a sustained weight decrease, sustained over 1 year, was Weight Watchers. And the factor that you just said about the Hawthorne effect, that was, again, the nutrition value of Weight Watchers is okay. It's not great. It's moderate. But the difference is they have support groups. They have partners. They have diets. The foods are supplied to people. So it's sustained. And it's that psychological group support, psychological commitment to that dietary program that is responsible for the sustained weight loss and health benefits. That is not inherent to the diet per se. It's not a particularly healthy diet, but it's one that people stay with because of the surrounding program. There's a lot we can learn from that.
Yes, get help, get accountability partners, and they go in for weekly weigh-ins. So there's there's a constant reminder that Monday's coming up, and they've got to do their weigh-ins. So they're paying a little bit more attention over the weekend to try to make Monday not such a day.
You've got it. Absolutely correct.
So, one of the things that I've been dealing with and really focused on from a health perspective over the course of the last year has been stress. I had a very stressful corporate job. That corporate job, I was laid off. And, I actually now look at that as a blessing because now I can actually focus on my life, my stress, and I have choice, which I feel really, really good about. But stress is also kind of one of those things that can really impact how our genes express and what's going on with our bodies.
Absolutely. Stress has, other than diet, probably the second, in some cases, primary influence on genetic expression is stress. And you also cited in your own case a really critical term, which is choice. When we can influence, external events and realize we have a choice, not over the external event, but we have a choice of our response. That one insight is critical. There's an apocryphal story about William James, who's the founder of modern psychology, that he was in a profound depression. He suffered from depression his whole life, and he was in a very deep depression. And what roused him out of his deep depression was the realization that he had a choice between one thought and the next. And that infinitesimal moment when he could choose between one depressing thought and another versus a depressing thought and a happy thought, that roused him out of his depression and gave rise to much of what he wrote. So, you hit on the critical factor of choice. Now, with stress, it's interesting. Stress is a complex subject, but let me try to, be brief. There are really two kinds of stress. One is short-term, immediate, when the source of stress is identifiable and resolvable. So if you think about it, you step off the curb, a car honks its horn, you jump back on the curb, and that saves your life. So the short-term stress, which is, in my books, I've called it type 1 stress. Short-term stress is the body is built to take that. We owe our survival as a species to it. If we didn't have it, we'd be dead. And then there's a type 2 stress, and that occurs when the source of stress is not immediate, not identifiable, and not resolvable. So if you think about it, most of the stress in our lives, worry about income or children or, career planning or, a conflict in a relationship, those are all long-term, not even always identifiable and not readily resolvable. That's the culprit. The type 2 stress is the killer. That's what affects our genes, and they affect through pathways like, in this case, as one example, excessive stress would increase inflammation. Inflammation predisposes to diabetes, heart disease, rheumatology diseases, irritable bowel, and a whole rash of other conditions. So this type 2 stress is the worst. Now, the common pathway between both of those is that if you perceive something to be threatening, so again, it's this matter of perception. If you think something is threatening, your body will react as though it's a real physical danger. So if you think that a change in your income is a threat to your physical well-being, your body will react as though you're being stalked by a saber-toothed tiger. It goes on red alert. All of your stress hormones increase, heart rate and blood pressure, and your body chemistry changes to one that's a red alert. For a short period of time, no problem. Our bodies are meant to take that. In fact, if you think about pleasurable activities, skydiving or whatever your thrilling pleasure is, we voluntarily enter into these situations to get that high. So it's actually, short-term stress actually gives us a high, increases perception and judgment and rote recall, et cetera. It's a good thing. When it goes on for too long, normal increases in body chemistry, normal increases in biological changes become a problem. So blood pressure will go up in the short run. If it stays elevated, that's hypertension. Our heart rates become slightly arrhythmic and rapid. If it goes on too long, that becomes tachycardia or various forms of life-threatening arrhythmias. Our bodies become rigid, so we're not pushed over. If that goes on for too long, we have musculoskeletal contractions and pains and headaches. The last one would be if, blood flow to the periphery of the body shuts down. And in type 1 stress, it's like with any other animal. If we're in a fight and you're cut, you won't bleed as much and you won't succumb to loss of blood. In the long run, it becomes things like peripheral artery disease, Raynaud's syndrome, whole host of other conditions. So it's this type 2 stress that's the culprit. The solution, and this is where the perception comes in, is once you think about it, just identify, how do you know when you personally are under stress? For some people, their mouth gets dry, that's the normal response. Neck tension, loss of appetite, racing thoughts, stomach upset. So something tells you, hey, you're under a lot of stress right now. If you can identify when you are moving down that type 2 pathway, you can then initiate a stress management technique, because that could be meditation. It could be yoga. It could be simple abdominal breathing. It could be reciting a poem or a prayer that's meaningful to you. It could be seeing an image of being on a beach, or walking in the mountains, or whatever. That will interrupt that cumulative type 2 destructive response into a short-term type 1 interval, which you can manage and recover. So the trick is not avoiding stress. It's to cycle in and out of this optimal zone where you have enough stress to be stimulated, to be excited, to be thrilled by what you're doing, but not so much that it's taxing on your body. That difference, so the type 1 stress does not have an adverse effect on your genes. Your genes are set up for short-term responses that basically preserve our integrity in our lives. And the difference with a type 2 is that upregulates, or in effect overexpresses that genetic predisposition in a way that's ultimately destructive. So that, if you will, in a perhaps too long a winded answer, is really how stress, one, affects our health, but also interacts with our genes and determines how well we do or do not manage the stress in our lives, which, it's inevitable. Stress is life.
Yeah.
If we weren't stressed, we'd be dead. Stress is certainly not bad. Excessive stress is simply destructive.
Yeah. What I would find is that I would, if there was an acute stress, I just needed to move and some form of movement. And sometimes it was throwing around heavy weights. Sometimes it was just going for a walk in nature. And the kind of the acute stress, that type 1 stress would kind of go away very, very quickly.
Yep.
If I found myself shallow breathing, just basically chest breathing, that's when I would start to recognize that I was consistently stressed. This was something that had been going on longer than just a few minutes. And that's where I found, yes, meditation and box breathing or something like that would be a good practice for me at that point in time to kind of let some of that go. Unfortunately, I just really wasn't, in my mind, and I'm still not really, really good at relieving stress as well as I should. So it's a practice and some things that I've been working on in the last several months, because I see that as the next big rock for me to be dealing with on my health. I'm pretty good about my food, and now I want to deal with that one. So I appreciate you taking the time. So you didn't go too long at all. That was actually excellent. I appreciate that. So the book is called. Oh, go ahead.
You just described exactly in your own personal situation what we were talking about. So for you, the shallow thoracic breathing, that's, again, hyperventilation. When we're under stress, your brain needs a lot of oxygen. You begin to breathe shallowly and slowly, a lot of oxygen to the brain for rapid reaction time. When it's over, think about it. You usually take a deep sigh, right? You go, yeah. That was close, it's over. Yeah. That tells your diaphragm, unlock, start to breathe more abdominally. If you can do that, which is what you're practicing, then that's the way to break the type 2 into type 1. The other critical thing that you said, and again, you're right on target, is practice. So if someone said, I want to learn to play the piano, you'd say, well, you're going to need lessons and practice, and it's going to take you time. And you'd say, well, yeah, of course, I know that. But if you say to a person, the person says, I want to learn how to manage stress better, and you say, well, it's going to take practice, and you have to learn it, and it's going to take time. They look at you like, really? Why should that be the case? The point is, it's a skill. And like any other skill, you can learn which one you need, when to initiate it, and as you do more of it, you get better over time. And quite literally, there's research that shows that as you practice a stress management technique, most of the benefits that you accrue initially are imaginary. You think that I'm relaxing, and really you're not changing your blood chemistry very much at all. But as you practice, the convergence between perceiving that you're managing it well and it actually happening on a physical level happens. So initially people say, well, I give up, or it's not really working. It's true initially, but over time it will.
Good. Thank you. So the book
you
is
got it.
the book is Change Your Genes. And like I said, this topic just fascinates me to no end. It's a really good book. If someone wanted to learn more about you and the book, where would you like for me to send them?
Probably I have a website, and it's very simple. It's drpelletier.com. And it has information on the book. I post articles, most of which have come from the book, that are the original sources for it. There are some videos of lectures I've given all the way from Singapore to Istanbul, so it's a good site, but it's just drpelletier.com. Very, very simple. Thank you for asking.
Oh, great. So you can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/344, and I'll be sure to have a link there. Dr. Pelletier, thank you for being a part of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and you're very knowledgeable. I appreciate the fact that you've obviously really thought about this. So thank you for letting me be your guest.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Dr. Pelletier is a fascinating man, and his book is so well done. If you're interested at all in epigenetics, this is the most recent research. He really did a great job of the research and did a really great job of explaining things in the book. So I'd encourage you to reach out and get that book. If you enjoyed the podcast, so I'd like to ask you if you wouldn't mind stepping in and becoming a Patreon and supporting the show. I want to thank the folks that have already done that. You're helping to cover the cost of posting and all the support I get from audio and the show notes and everything that goes into getting the podcast done. You know, we are doing some extra episodes this month, so there are some additional costs. I appreciate anyone and everyone that stepped up to become a Patreon. And you can as well by going to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/Patreon. And that's spelled Patreon. Of course, you can go to the show notes of this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/344, and I'll have a link to that Patreon. You'll see that right on the top there. And I list the Patreons that contribute at least $4 a month. So it's about $1 an episode for most months. It's about 50 cents an episode for the month of October. So please do go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/Patreon and become a patron of the show. Show your support and help me make this podcast as wonderful as I can. And if you haven't already, please do check out thewellnessroadmapbook.com. I'm building that out right now to support the launch of the book, which is expected to happen in early part of December. I'm working on getting everything cinched up there, but I'm putting together the materials there so you can learn a lot about the book. And if you want to do learn any more, you can go ahead and sign up to be a part of the launch team. The launch team gets weekly updates that I don't share anywhere else, and they're also going to get some pretty cool bonuses and surprises as we go along. So thank you for those that have joined the launch team. I really appreciate you. And if you haven't joined the launch team, well, please do. Go to wellnessroadmapbook.com. That's the wellnessroadmapbook.com. Thank you. Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet JJ Smith and discuss her book, Think Yourself Thin. Until then, have a happy and healthy day.